Hello, students. First of all, I'm sorry I'm late posting this video. This is going to be a very short introduction to poetry, as you see here on your syllabus. We're not going to go through the book. You are going to go through the book on your own. It's page 699 to page 719. And I'll put that in the instructions under this video. It is a long chapter, but it's essential that you read the entire thing because there's a lot of essential and invaluable information about approaching poetry, reading poetry, moving through poetry, understanding poetry, all of that that you really need for this unit. So your homework is to read that whole chapter, and then of course also to read the poems that are listed on your syllabus. I will also put them in I'll upload them, I'll link them rather, to the Blackboard course content. We're not going to do this, the sample response to Robert Haas. I have written a literary analysis essay around analyzing a poem that I want to give you as an example of how to maybe do that. I had to do it for grad school to get into the programs. So it's already all done. I always sample essays are useful, but I always kind of wanted to see my professor's sample essays because it's like, okay, well, how would you do it, So that's why I'm going to give you that, but we're not really there yet. I'm not really sure why I thought I was going to do that today. I'd like to save that for maybe when I hand back essays. Well, I won't hand them back, but you'll get back feedback for your essays next week. Maybe then we should talk about this because then we can go back to a sample essay and look at the parts of it, or maybe when we get closer to your essay assignment. Either way, all we're going to be talking about today is I'm going to give you a little intro, my own intro to poetry, what it is, why we read it still, why we write it. We're probably not going to go over poetic terms either. I just want to focus just on getting into poetry. We'll read 2 poems together, and then you will read these poems on your own. And like I said, of course, they will be uploaded onto Blackboard. So once again, I'm sorry I'm late on this video. I'm not feeling super well. It's nothing serious, but that's why we're going to keep this short. And then I will be moving through your essays for the remainder of the week. All right, so before we even talk about poetry, I would like to read to you 2 poems and then discuss them a bit. So first we've got Ars Poetica. Ars Poetica essentially means you know what? I always butcher the meaning, so let's look it up. Ars Poetica definition. What does Ars Poetica mean? A treatise on the art of literary and especially poetic composition. So in Ars Poetica, it's like a poem's mission statement, not an individual poem, but poetry is really what an Ars Poetica is. And poets write Ars Poetica poems to define their approach to poetry, essentially. So this is Archibald MacLeish's Ars Poetica. A poem should be palpable and mute, a globed fruit, dumb as old medallions to the thumb, silent as the sleeve-worn stone of casement ledges where the moss has grown. A poem should be wordless as the flight of birds. A poem should be motionless in time as the moon climbs, leaving as the moon releases twig by twig the night entangled trees, leaving as the moon behind the winter leaves, memory by memory the mind. A poem should be motionless in time as the moon climbs. A poem should be equal to, not true, for all the history of grief, an empty doorway and a maple leaf, for love, the leaning grasses and 2 lights above the sea. A poem should not mean, but be. There's a couple of things I want to talk about with this poem that your book will address too. Not this poem, but what poems do. You must have heard it as I was reading. We have mute, fruit, dumb thumb, stone grown, wordless birds, time climb, releases, trees, a bit of a slant rhyme. So a direct rhyme would be stone and grown. Wordless birds and releases and trees, those are slant rhymes. So you've got some vowel letters, vowels that sound the same, right? They rhyme, but it's not a direct or overt rhyme. Then we've got a change here. Winter leaves, memory by memory, the mind, but then we get time and climb. So mind, time, climb, these kind of all go, and leaves, trees, releases kind of all sound together. Two, true, grief, leave, love and see, different. However, C and B. So there's an interesting and kind of unusual pattern to this, but the sounds of the rhymes, even the slant rhymes, create kind of a sing-songy rhythm as we move through the poem. So one of the things your book talks about is how poetry, to be defined as poetry, requires sort of an unusual or a rhythm that removes it from prose, right? We have that here. And also unusual language, rhythm, or devices to evoke meaning. And we have that here too. So Archibald MacLeish is discussing what a poem should be and what it should not be. It should not be, a poem should be equal to, not true. In other words, it shouldn't exactly be factual. Like a poem can be honest without being true in a factual sense, right? Anyway, I think this is a lovely introduction to poetry in general, all the things a poem should be. And I want to really zero in on this. A poem should not mean, but be. All right, so when we read a poem, we are, and I will be asking you to move beyond the surface level and try to get under that poem, get inside it, try to figure out what it does mean. But if you are setting out to write a poem for it to mean a certain thing, likely it will not be a very good poem because a poem must first exist and become a home for that meaning. And that's a kind of mysterious concept that is difficult to further explain. But I hope as we move through this unit, you'll understand the distinction between a poem being a container for all the things it means and a poem trying to tell you something. Like poems are not often trying to tell us something, but we act as if they are. We read them as if there's a message or a mystery or like a hidden thing, or it's trying to give us instructions, right? Very rarely is that the case with poetry. A poem is existing, and the way in which it exists and the way in which it moves through our mind is the meaning, you know? All right. Let's, with that in mind, move on to this other poem by Billy Collins called Introduction to Poetry. I love reading this at the beginning of a poetry unit. You'll see why. I asked them to take a poem and hold it to the light like a color slide, or press an ear against its hive. I say, drop a mouse into a poem and watch him probe his way out, or walk inside the poem's room and feel the walls for a light switch. I want them to water ski across the surface of the poem, waving at the author's name on the shore. But all they want to do is tie the poem to a chair with rope and torture a confession out of it. They begin beating it with a hose to find out what it really means. So Billy Collins in his poem sounds to me like he's talking about students, introducing poetry to students. And in his poem, he is addressing that final line from Archibald MacLeish's poem of a poem should not mean but be. And he's saying, Billy Collins is saying, because a poem just exists, we need to find all these other ways into it, right? You cannot tie a poem to a chair and ask it what it really means, because it really means 1,000 things. If we link this back to Rosenblatt's transactional theory of literature, each one of these poems means something different to you than it means to me, and it means something different to your classmate than it means to you. We are, as readers, the people who imbue the poems with meaning. But poetry, I would say, more so than prose, exists and moves and lives in such a way in the world and in our minds and in our bodies where those possible different meanings are even more accessible and exciting, because poems can mean many different things. You can tell I'm really tired. I'm sure I'm feeling like my brain is a little not right. All right, so I'd like to talk briefly about, let's see, what should I have up in the background so as not to distract you. Let's just go back to the beginning of this chapter so we can stare at the word poetry while I talk about poetry. Okay, so the first thing, like I said, you're going to read 699 through 719, I believe. The first thing I want you to know about poems is that there are three main categories or genres of poetry. There is narrative, dramatic, and lyrical. So quick definitions. Narrative poetry tells a story. I can't think of an example right now, but anytime you're reading a poem and there's like something happening kind of similar to the short stories we've been reading, a beginning, middle, and end, an arc, a point, that's narrative poetry. It tells us there's characters, right? It tells us about what is happening to those characters. So narrative poetry tells a story. Dramatic poetry is really interesting. Dramatic poetry, persona poems are under dramatic poetry. Persona poems are when the writer pretends to be a different person. So if I was going, or thing, I could write a persona poem about the wardrobe that holds all my clothes, and use personification to make it become this more human-like thing. That would be a persona poem. You can also write, persona poems are often about historical figures, imagined people, celebrities. But the point is, a persona poem is the writer stepping into a character that is not them and writing from that character's point of view. And that falls under dramatic poetry. Dramatic poetry can also be sort of like a mix of narrative, where it can be like these kind of epic, long, sort of sagas that could be like a bit dramatic, but a bit narrative too. So one thing to be clear about, these three different genres do not have to be exclusive. Like, you can have a narrative poem that's also a dramatic poem. You can have a lyrical poem, which we haven't gotten to, that's also a bit narrative. So they don't always exist alone, but they do exist, and it's important to know what they are. And then we have the lyrical poems. Lyrical poems are the poemy poems, so to speak. They're the ones that are like, they take place in the mind. They're often about abstract concepts and big ideas, and often a lyrical poem will use something very concrete to approach these abstract concepts, right? But it's not telling a story, and it's not pretending to be someone else, and it's not dialogue between two people like you might find in like an epic, dramatic narrative poem. It's more about the internal space of the writer's mind. That's often the setting of a lyrical poem. It doesn't have to take place in space and time. It doesn't have to have a story arc. Those are very brief introductions. You'll get a much better introduction if you read through this chapter, or when you read through this chapter. So please make sure that you do that. The last thing I want to say is that the poems you're reading this week are all, you'll see a thread through them. They all have to do with America at various times through history, but they're all very different takes on America, and I want to talk about that next week when we come back together. And by talk about that, I guess I mean I'll talk about it and maybe throw up a discussion question, but I want you to be thinking about, what do these poems have in common besides that they touch on America? What are they saying? What are they saying that's the same? What are they saying that's different? If these poems were people, how might they talk to each other? I'm not asking you to do anything with those questions other than keep them in your head while you're reading. So you are going to be reading, let's go back to our syllabus. You're going to quickly read Stop All the Clocks, Cut Off All the Phones by Auden. You're going to read that, and you're going to read the response paper to that, okay? That's sort of separate from these America poems. Do that so you get a sense of immediately reading a poem while reading the analysis of it, because that will help model for you how I want you to be analyzing poetry. And then you're going to move on to I Hear America Singing by Walt Whitman, I Too by Langston Hughes, America by Allen Ginsberg. This is not in your book. Also, a warning about America. Allen Ginsberg was a very interesting person. I guess what I really want to say is that there's some language in this America poem that I am uncomfortable with, and I want to give you a trigger warning about that language. The language that Allen Ginsberg uses is not, he's using it to make fun of people who are harmful and use that language harmfully. However, the language is still in the poem, so I want to warn you about that. And then The Palace by Kaveh Akbar. Kaveh Akbar is a young poet, a young Iranian American poet who is writing currently. So you'll see that each poem is kind of from a different point in American history, but they all are tackling America in one way or another. And I want you to really think about how they're doing that as you read through these. I think that that's all I'd like to say. This is just a quick week. You have plenty of reading to do. This chapter is really, really long. You do have 4 poems, but the good thing about poems, they may be difficult to really, you may have to read them 1,000 times to get what you want out of them, but it's not still not the same word number. It's still not the same number of pages when you're reading 4 short stories. So this poetry unit is both more challenging and less challenging in a way. It's more challenging to really get inside the poems and really analyze them and take them apart and write about them. It's less challenging because you may find yourself with a little bit more time than you had when we were reading our fiction or going through our fiction unit. All right, thank you. I will turn this off now.